Hi everyone. Today I would like to spend some time with you on the topic of how we can use social annotation to create a coordination engine for metamodern understanding. I actually wrote an article on this topic, framing it from a different standpoint from the question of how we can use social media to foster Bildung, which is a related concept. You will find it attached beneath this video. And in this article, I tried to look at the potential of social annotation, the way it already is being used in academic context and settings, and how we could expand social annotations from the context of academia into the life world and use it in the life world to coordinate people across different interest groups, age groups, across different worldviews, different frames, and so on. Because I believe this is crucial, a crucial technology, a crucial tool that we need to develop if we want to see something like metamodernism spreading. Because the complex ideas we're dealing with in metamodernism require tools that help us get those complex ideas across, that help us actually make those complex ideas being understood. The traditional way of doing this, the linear narrative form that we've been using ever since, just won't do the job. It is too reductive. It doesn't get the depth of our ideas across. I could also title the following How I Broke Integral, How Integral Broke Me, or How to Bake Depth into the Structure of Our Media. How we can make media to not flatten our communication and understanding, not polarize us, but how we can turn them into the opposite direction, how we can turn them into incentives for development and mutual understanding just by virtue of using new media. When we started out our course on metamodernism, it felt a little bit like the entire project was an attempt to fix Integral's problems and to avoid the mistakes that Integral had made. Now, my impression was that Integral was indeed suffering from certain challenges, but those would have still remained even with all the suggestions that we have made so far, like, for example, fixing the aesthetics of it, introducing the element of self-irony, and so on and so on. What were these elements? Well, for one, it was very much the experience that after the initial excitement about everyone being on board and sharing this meta narrative, people kind of felt like, now what? Like, what do you do with this? What do you build from this? And it's very soon actually started to show that people had very, very different expectations and felt disappointed in their expectations. This would made people actually more and more disagreeable, and they started fighting over more fine distinctions in the course of time. Many introduced their own language with additional concepts that they introduced, and one had to submit to those concepts. And if one didn't, one was not part of the subgroup that was then forming within Integral. So this was a phenomenon that I believe was very strongly visible, that people could not cooperate across very, very different backgrounds and worldviews without facing certain challenges. And Integral was not something comparable to a traditional institution like, for example, the academy, where people are synchronized over long periods of time, where they're given the same literature to study, where they're actually being paid to study, and so on. Integral had to coordinate those people with very, very little resources. You didn't have many bullets to spare and available. And what it failed at, it failed in my impression to simply coordinate those people and help them communicate across their worldviews. Simply because people were very, very different, and they inherently experienced each other not necessarily as friends but as threats. Integral didn't help with making you better understand the position of somebody else who is part of the community and who has entirely different knowledge interests than you have and who is speaking a different language than you have. Integral failed at creating connection points between specialists and generalists, for example, like cosmologists. It also failed in making connection points between specialists from different academic fields. They just didn't share the same language. And the initial hope was that the meta model itself Integral theory would do the job of creating the connection between the people. But this worked only for a small minority. Most of the people had so different understandings of integral theory itself that they could not agree on a common language that would actually unite them. And the other experience was that many of the people who were there in the beginning of Integral Institute wanted to contribute. They wanted to commit themselves. They were highly motivated, and they were very much willing to bring in a part of themselves to be able to contribute, but they didn't have a way of contributing. It was really the felt sense of, now what? What do you do with all these people? How do you actually make them productive? And just giving them a forum in which they can express opinions was just not enough. It was not a constructive way of getting something out of the people in the positive sense of pushing them to their max so that they can really show their excellence in a specific field and share that excellence with anybody else. So many of those who wanted to contribute couldn't, and they simply left. And many others who were interested in learning about details, about the map itself, well, were confronted with mostly the same repetitive discussions of integral theory, despite the talk that you should actually look at the territory and not at the map, which simply means that you have to intellectually engage with many different disciplines. This is not something that was happening within the Integral Institute simply because nobody could pull it off. It's not an academy. So would any of the challenges that I just sketched have been fixed with the changes that we suggested coming with metamodernism? Like, for example, by making it less cultic, less person-oriented, more self-critical, and so on. Would any of these issues have been solved? Again, these are not just minor issues. These were big issues back in the day that actually made many people leave. They had no choice. If you wanted to be a specialist in a field, you just couldn't become a specialist by spending time in Integral Institute. You had to leave and go back to academia. And I know many people who actually did this and never used integral language again. Just as if you wanted to become a generalist or cosmologist, Integral Institute was not the place where you could become that. You had to leave and basically in solitude continue that quest. Just ask yourself, would a young Ken Wilber have spent time at Integral Institute? I think he wouldn't have spent more than 3 days there, and then he would have gotten back to solitude and reading books and writing books. So would any of these challenges have been addressed with what we suggested in the context of metamodernism? I don't think so, because I believe the major challenge was actually that Integral was lacking a coordination engine for understanding. It was lacking a coordination engine that could bring people together from so different backgrounds in a constructive way so that they can be productive with each other. The traditional way of doing this, where you have leadership, you have a person who brings the people together, worked for a small amount of time. Wilbur had actually taken up this leadership. He was able to bring diverse people together. It was constructive, but this was not something that was scalable. It was not something that worked for the entire community. It worked for, I don't know, a small percentage of them. They actually wrote books together, they wrote articles together, but all the others basically became mere observers and couldn't really participate in this thing. And I don't think this would have been solved with any of the suggestions that we made. Wilber himself actually suggested that Integral needs new forms of communication because the complexity of ideas that are actually involved that cannot be transferred through traditional linear media. But Integral didn't come up with this new form of communication, a new form of organizing people. It didn't have an idea how to actually implement this. In reality, Integral was mostly talk. It was a forum where you could exchange opinions with other people. It was not very much distinguishable from what existed in other social media spaces already. It was more pluralistic. It had some kind of meta-narrative which kind of served as a bridge, but that was it. It didn't have any kind of technology that would unite people across differences. And in a very similar vein, Verwicki just recently criticized Peterson and said that Peterson is overemphasizing narrative and not seeing that what we also need is that which binds us across narratives. We need the trans narrative. Well, in Integral, this was exactly the challenge. The idea was that the meta theory should actually be this trans-narrative thing, the thing that actually brings us together. But it turned out it's not enough. The meta-narrative alone is not enough. You need also specific practices. You need specific challenges that people can actually face together, and so on. All of this Integral was missing, and it was missing a new form of medium that would allow for communication between different points of views that use different frames, different language games to actually be comprehensible to each other and not feel triggered by each other. So, what is the approach that I'll be following? Instead of focusing on narrative, I'll be focusing on structure. And there is a wonderful niche in German media theory called strukturale Medienbildung. It is basically theory that looks at the structure of the medium and how the structure of a medium can actually influence the kind of content that is being produced. Or in other words, how the structure of a medium can actually induce development in the individuals using the medium. The opposite of social media as we know it. Social media usually flatten down our interactions. They flatten down the complexity of a thought to flat narratives that are mostly triggering to other people. This is the opposite. Here the idea is that through structural incentives, you can actually create depth. You can actually force people to be self-reflexive. You can actually scale self-reflexivity across people who have very different viewpoints, and you don't have to narrow them down. You don't have to bring them together in one single meta-narrative. You can actually leave them with their individual narratives and yet guarantee that their narratives at least are self-reflexive, that they have an element of self-irony, that they have a genetic element, and so on. We'll come to these points. But that's the general idea. The general idea is focus on the structure of the medium instead of the content itself or the narrative itself. Or if you want another comparison, the traditional way of approaching the question of education in the German-speaking world was to say, look, there is a canon of classical books that you all have to study. And once you have studied these books, they will guarantee that you will get along because you will have a shared language, you will have shared attitudes, you will have shared values, and those will make sure that you will be able to speak to each other, right? This is the traditional way of doing this. And I don't want to fully replace it, but I think it has to be complemented with this structural approach. The structural approach says it is not so important. Of course, there are deeper books than other books, and certain books have to be read, but more important are the incentives that you put into the medium itself. So if the medium forces you to self-reflect on your position, this is something that is inherently going to force you to produce narratives that are self-reflexive, right? Or if the medium itself forces you to make connections to other narratives, this is again an incentive that not through the narrative, but through the structure will make you think in more complex ways. And here, this is something, by the way, where both approaches can come together. Of course, you can use the traditional approach combined with the structural approach to incentivize more depth in our interactions. All right, and now we get to the juicy stuff. Now we get to the actual solution, the memics. What was the memics? It was a vision that Vannevar Bush had in the first half of the 20th century. And what he envisioned was a machine that was basically recording while you were learning or while you were reading. What the machine was recording were not facts, but what the machine was recording is your individual learning path that you take through a text. It is recording, in other words, your subjectivity in motion. For example, it records which passages are important to you, which passages you don't understand, which passages you disagree with. It records if you make connections between a passage in a book and another passage in another book. So what this machine is doing is it is recording your associative trails that you leave behind, or your learning path that you leave behind, which becomes visible for others. It's not recording objective facts, it's recording subjectivity. It is, in other words, if you want to bring it to together with John Vervaeke's language, what it's recording is your personal path of relevance realization. It is recording your subjectivity in motion and providing that subjectivity as an orientational guide for others to develop their own relevance realizations. And obviously, if you look at it, this is not something that was new. This is not a new invention. We have been doing annotations forever. Annotations are as old as scripture is. If you think about the annotations on Aristotle, which were crucial to understanding Aristotle in the first place, what is special about annotations, though, is that they are, in a sense, low-stakes writing. Annotations are the things that we write down and are closest to where our mind actually meets the world and tries to make sense of the world. Any published text usually is the result of a lot of reflection and a lot of abstraction and a lot of corrections. Annotations, on the other hand, are the things that you write down immediately when your mind touches reality. So they are closest, they are the most intimate thing, the closest thing to your actual subjectivity in motion. In your annotations, you can see things that you would never find in a published manuscript. You would never find things like, for example, confusions or misunderstandings. All these uncertainties or imperfections, if you want, that are part of your making sense of a text that you're just reading, none of those are usually being seen in the final version of whatever you write on a specific topic. But all of those are being seen in your annotations. And the memex, the thing that Vannevar Bush was envisioning, was exactly that kind of machine that was making visible your subjectivity as it is unfolding and as it is going and trying to make sense of something and make connections on the go, before it has been reflected on itself and before it has been purified and correctified into propositions that then are then published in the final paper. So annotation captures aspects of your subjectivity that otherwise would never be visible. For example, it is very unlikely that Habermas has written in his last book, which book was his favorite book of the year 2019, for example. It's very unlikely he has ever written this down, but I'm pretty sure he might have a favorite book of the year 2019. With annotation, you could actually figure this out, because annotation expresses all these aspects of subjectivity that never actually get to be written down in the final manuscript. And this is something that is incredibly valuable as a source. Just think about it. If we had the annotations available on Kant, for example, the kind of annotations that he made while he was reading a specific script, it would become much, much easier to understand what Kant is actually saying in his final works if we knew where he got his inspirations from and what actually inspired him to make certain conclusions and to think certain things. Because we would see the genesis of his thought. We would see how, from touching a reality, his subjectivity forms itself into conclusions and into defendable final theses and texts that he then publishes to the public. And the memex makes all these aspects of subjectivity visible to the public eye. They are not private anymore, but they are potentially visible for others. Now, you won't be surprised that the memex is not a vision anymore, that it has become reality in the 21st century. With software, it has been implemented. And there are many different implementations. Some of the most successful ones are Hypothesis, a software that has been used in the context of many academic institutions and institutes, and the memex by Oliver Sauter, which is more of a personal tool that you can use to basically collect your own learning path and trace your own learning path on different issues. So what the memex does as a concept, which has now become reality, is it is a form of augmented reality for subjectivity, right? If you have augmented reality where you have an object and that object is layered upon with all kinds of different connections to other objects and facts that you can know about the object, here in a very similar vein, what happens is that you have a sentence. And what the software provides you with is the ability to annotate that specific sentence, to add your layers of subjectivity to that specific sentence, while at the same time somebody else can add their subjective associations and layers onto that sentence. So you augment, you literally have here an augmented reality for thought or for subjectivity. You take a sentence and immediately you can see what are the different possible ways in which this sentence can be related to. Right? It's not you have linear narratives, but it's the other way around. You have a sentence and you can see all the possible pathways away from a specific statement that you find. This shows you all the possible connections and pathways which are available to a community making sense of a text. Now, during the past few years, particularly during the pandemic, teachers had to find a way to make students read the text in an engaging way. They had made the experience that when the students are not meeting in person, it was actually difficult to motivate them to do the reading. And they used hypothesis, this memics implementation, this tool that basically implements the memics and allows the students to add their own annotations to a text. They used hypothesis to motivate the students to do the reading. And what happened then is that the students were able, through social annotation, to self-organize and conquer the territory of the text. How would this happen? Well, the first thing is the professors would actually give different kinds of annotations that they expected. So they create a structure. So for example, what is salient for you? What is content that is actually important for your own thinking, right? This is one type of highlight or annotation. Another type of highlight is what do you not agree with? Or what do you not understand? Or what do you think is the frame that is being used in a specific passage? Or is there a logical or rhetorical tool that is being used in a specific sentence? So they create, with these structural incentives, a landscape from which what the students have then to do is to basically fill in the details. And what happens in this process is that usually the teachers don't have to get very involved because the students themselves, having available the annotations of their own peers, figure out how they can make relevant the text that they're reading for themselves. And what this helps them with is that even something that's very difficult to digest, they manage to digest as a community. In a sense, they manage to distribute intelligence, if you want to use a loose metaphor here. What they manage to do, for example, is you start reading a text and you see it's boring, you can't make sense of it, but you see 5 pages ahead somebody has annotated something. This gives you a hint, hey, keep the reading up, don't give up, because this is something that other people can't make sense of either. But the relevance realization comes in 5 pages. Stay with it, stick with it. Or you meet a passage that is difficult to understand, and you immediately opening up the sentence that is difficult for you to understand, see, aha, this is one way in which you can interpret it and make sense of this. Aha, this is a different way. Aha, this is additional information that now makes me understand this sentence better because someone has pointed out a connection between the sentence and another passage in the author's oeuvre, for example, which actually makes the idea much clearer. So as a community, the students actually manage to conquer pretty complex territory without the teachers being particularly involved. All the teachers have to do is they have to assign different roles. For example, you do the role of the synthesizer, you do the role of the summarizer, you do the role of the devil's advocate, for example. So assign different roles, assign different type of annotations. That's all. They don't have to be more specific about that. And this structure alone is already creating a frame which helps the students to bring order into the chaos, which is the text. It helps them to make the text their own and to find a way into the text that is relevant to them and that actually sticks with them. And what then happens is that when the students meet, the interactions are not they're not small talk, but the interactions usually begin with an incentive around a specific sentence that 2 people find interesting. From 400 people in a course, you might find the one person that might be able to help you with this one specific sentence that you just found interesting. So your initial interaction starts by this initializer, which is the sentence itself. It doesn't start with what hair color you have, what eye color you have. It starts with what do you think about this one specific sentence. And this is how people can find each other. People, again, hundreds of students sometimes part in these courses, they can find each other with this kind of tool at hand because it organizes their interactions and makes them highly efficient. What we see happening with social annotation is that we are creating or we're retaining order without imposing a narrative. The only thing we are imposing is structure. We expect from the students to be able to take a position and then take a position on their position, to be self-reflective. We expect the students to show the genesis of their point of view. This is to show how they come to their conclusions, what inspires their conclusions. What we incentivize layers of annotations, like different types of annotations that we're adding. We are incentivizing to separate different spaces in which you have different responsibilities. Again, if you take up a different role for within the course, you have different responsibilities. Somebody can just be an observer, another can just post the annotations, another one might be highly engaged with the whole thing and might have the job to actually summarize the annotations and come up with a final text that actually summarizes the tendencies of the group, of how they make sense of the whole thing. And you have both. You have, on the one hand, you have hierarchy, because within those spaces where people have certain responsibilities, those people who are taking up higher responsibilities will be heard by more other people. They will have a stronger signal. They will be able to actually send out something to the others and be sure that they will receive it. While those who have a lesser commitment will still be able to send out their signal to everybody and wait for others to pick it up, those who are in the more responsible roles. So you have, on the one hand, you have hierarchy, you have people who have more responsibilities and more rights, on the other hand, to be heard, more rights for their signal to reach others. On the other hand, it's also hierarchical. It's something that's very, very democratic, because you are retaining all of the voices. You're not censoring basically anyone, but the censorship basically happens on the level of what the community itself finds is acceptable within the context of the learning cycle. What kind of positions are positions that are up to the level of being reasonable, and which positions are not up to the level of being reasonable. That's something that the community itself can actually figure out, of course with the help of the teachers, who have in the end the final role of actually sanctioning certain actions as being not allowed within the learning space. What are some of the core principles behind social annotation that are very valuable? I suggest the following. The first one is orientation. Social annotation provides us with the possibility to easily see tendencies, for example, to see where a culture is at, what the major ideas are that are driving a certain knowledge, culture, or paradigm, to see where individuals are coming from, what the major ideas and observations, all the exciting stuff that actually makes up your worldview, where it's coming from. Another aspect is self-contextualization. So social annotation helps us to see how our approach and our perspective, our frame, is one among many that we can take on a specific issue. Social annotation also helps us with self-transcendence. Hereby I simply mean that we can see the genesis of our perspective. We can see how from a pre-understanding we develop a perspective that reflects on our prior perspective. We see the genesis of how something becomes a perspective. And then again, we reflect on our perspective and see how we can develop a further perspective. The genetic aspect is something that you usually don't ever see in propaganda. Propaganda is just there. You never see where it's coming from. Another important aspect is the participatory. So social annotation is from the start participatory. It includes everybody at their own pace with whatever they can contribute. And all these contributions are synchronized to form wholes and to come meaningfully together. Yet another aspect is understanding. We were speaking about the coordination engine for understanding. Social annotation fosters understanding by making the background assumptions, our bias if you want to say, and our most private experiences in a sense visible. Social annotation makes visible the horizon of pre-understanding and thus makes the other actually more accessible to us, closer to us, because we're then not talking in pure high-level abstractions anymore. We're talking about very concrete observations, very, very concrete things that touch us on the level of pre-abstracted life world. Another aspect which is very important is systematicity. Social annotation helps us to create links between different disciplines, between different worldviews, between different paradigms, and those links are right there in the margins. You read something and you see how it's connected to all kinds of different worlds. A term which is useful in this context is building wormholes into other universes. Social annotation also includes the principle of order. It's a space where we can order the interactions of those who are involved in such ways that they don't obstruct each other. So you can always retain someone's individual perspective and yet place it within a collective stream, or if you want, a collective center of gravity, to see how it comes together with other individual perspectives. Yet both are still kept apart and not taking from each other's space for articulation. And social annotation, in a sense, is, I wouldn't say distributed intelligence, maybe we're going too far with this, but it is at least distributed curation. So what you can do is you can conquer a relatively complex territory together with others and come up with a unified whole that helps others, again, to better understand the conquered territory, to see all the highlights, all the dangerous and dead ends, and all the different ways in which you could make it relevant for yourself. Now it's your turn. I'd be really interested to hear some of your takes on how we can use social annotation in the context of metamodern thought and spreading metamodern thought and organizing metamodern communities. You can come up with your very own question and suggestion, but let me give you just a few orientational ones which I find very interesting. I'd be very curious to hear what you think about them. So if we look back at the initial challenge that I posed, that Integral faced, and if we raise the questions again, how, for example, could social annotation help us to communicate better between specialists and generalists? Do you see any way in which social annotation could be actually helpful here? Also, how could social annotation help us with grand narratives? How could it make doing grand narrative actually easier and more interesting and more fun and more social, instead of the traditional way of doing it, which is a very solitary activity? How could we use social annotation to help everybody to contribute so that they actually make a difference, however small, to the whole thing, a cumulative difference, a difference that adds up with the differences contributed by others, instead of creating chaos and noise and polarization? I've grouped them by three. There is no bigger pattern behind it. I just like pairs of three. How could we use social annotation to coordinate people across worldviews into productive interactions? So not just talking, but actually creating something, doing something together. How could we bring social annotation from the academic setting, which I described to you, and where it's already working? It has been very successful to the degree that even JSTOR is now integrating social annotation basically into its digital texts. How could we bring that into the live world? How could we create something that functions not only within the setting of being forced to use it, but within the setting of the live world, where it's actually fun and you want to use it? How could social annotation bring people together in thick relationships? What we've been talking so far about are just thin relationships, where you learn something from other people but don't feel particularly connected or particularly responsible for them. But I could imagine that social annotation can also be an inspiring position to actually bring together people into thick relationships, the stuff of which communities are actually built. Because so far we have not really talked about communities in this context. How could we use social annotation to reduce complexity? Or how could it be used to get metamodern ideas across? How could we use social annotation to communicate those ideas without writing these long texts that apparently nobody really reads, at least not the footnotes and the important passages? So there's quite a lot of misunderstanding out there in the world. Could we actually help that to alleviate that misunderstanding to a certain degree? And how could we use social annotation to actually constructively criticize metamodernism itself? The way we've been doing this so far has not been very successful. By what I've seen so far, the criticism has been pretty bad. And I don't think it's a personal issue. I think it's a systemic issue. I think there are systemic reasons why the criticism is actually pretty bad so far. It was exactly the same situation with integral theory. And I believe the major reason there also was systemic, and not because, Wilbur was just evil. So pick any of those questions, or if you have your own, please contribute them. These are just inspirations, but I'd be really curious to hear what you think about these issues. Let me just close on the following note, that I believe that social annotation is actually the missing piece which is necessary to make a vision, like for example Zach Stein's, and I know that some of you know his work, Zach Stein's vision of educational hubs possible and pragmatically feasible. It is, if you want, the engineering perspective, the lower right quadrant perspective, which is missing in his work, and it is the perspective which has to do with coordinating interactions. It is an autistic perspective, I'm aware of that, but without that autistic engineering perspective, we can't scale what Zach actually is envisioning across a diversity of people. And the core idea is simply that here the medium is used to bring people together who will be most likely relevant to each other and could actually help each other with the challenges that they are facing. The idea is not that the medium is supposed to replace the human-human interaction, but actually to generate the right occasions for human-human interaction that is actually productive. So if you can get Zach to read my article, I'll be really grateful. I tried, but he did read it. Maybe I shouldn't have presented myself as a truck driver. That didn't help very much. So that'd be really awesome, because I really believe it's at least one missing part to the overall picture that should be considered.